Another local personality that was mentioned in my first Tobey Book presentation was Reverend Joshua Webster. He was a well-known Methodist minister at Hilton. His work is found in many pages of the Tobey Book, where lists of marriages for a particular year are displayed. On page 127, we see the marriages for 1836. This is the first year of marriages in Joshua Webster's register, and they go on to 1874. We are very lucky to have the full content of Reverend Webster's marriage register in the form of this booklet that was published in the 1990s by the Seventh Town Historical Society. The title says, Marriage Register of Joshua Webster for the Methodist Episcopal Church, Hilton, Northumberland County, 1836 to 1874. We also see that this document was a transcription from the original register, and it was transcribed with useful indexes by Judy and Bill Mills. This document is extremely important in my work with local history and family trees, and I refer to it routinely. Aside from the marriage register, information about the family of Joshua Webster has been represented in my genealogy database and on the website www.treesbydan.com, but only to a limited degree. As often happens when I was preparing for this presentation, I dug deeper into the history of Joshua Webster and his family. There are several references to Joshua Webster in the Tobey Book, aside from the lists of marriages. However, most are couched in terms of him being a relative of Wilmot Maxwell Tobey, the creator of the Tobey Book. On page 65, Mr. Tobey says, My grandmother being a daughter of Reverend Joshua Webster, who settled north of Brighton in 1815. The text goes on to describe how he recalled his mother operating a spinning wheel. We can see by this bit of the Tobey family tree that here is Maxwell Tobey in the middle. His father was Milton Benjamin Tobey, and his mother was Nettie Wells. Her parents were Wilmot James Wells and Mary Beriah Webster. And her parents were Joshua Webster and Rebecca Merriman. So that information is absolutely correct. However, some of the information, especially that about the early location of Joshua Webster in Upper Canada, is wrong. At the time of the creation of the Tobey Book, it was commonly thought that Joshua Webster had come to the Hilton area around 1815 or 1816. This information is repeated consistently throughout the Tobey Book. This is a good example of the reality that we must be very careful with information from any source, even the Tobey Book. Details that come from anecdotal stories must be confirmed from other sources. I consider that to be part of my job as a local historian. Let's look more closely at Joshua Webster. He was born in 1794 in Glastonbury, Hartford County, Connecticut, another one of the many settlers in this area who came from Connecticut. In 1812, at age 18, he volunteered for a time with the New York militia during the War of 1812. Then, only 3 years later, we see that he is in Upper Canada, in Crammy Township, working as a school teacher. But he is not at Hilton. Instead, he is at the far southwest corner of Crammy Township, near the Keeler settlement. This is clearly stated in the introduction to Reverend Webster's registers. In 1817, Joshua Webster married Rebecca Merriman, a daughter of Joel Merriman. The Merrimans were from Connecticut, and they were members of the Keeler Group, a band of settlers who came to Upper Canada around 1792 with Joseph Keeler and established themselves there on the shore of Lake Ontario at what they called Keeler Creek and what we know of today as Lakeport. In 1818, Joseph Keeler Jr. established a general store on the York Road just north of the Keeler settlement. And this little village would be called the Corners. In the late 1830s, the village took on a more dignified name in honor of John Colborne, the Lieutenant Governor of Upper Canada. I also found a document that shows Joshua Webster living near the Corners in 1824. An itinerant Methodist minister named Anson Green wrote a journal of his travels as he serviced Newcastle District. At one point, he mentions on one circuit that he traveled from Cobourg to Presqu'île, on to Trentport, then north to Cold Creek, then to Percy Mills, and then down back to the lake shore where he preached at the home of Joshua Webster before returning to Cobourg via Grafton. This places Joshua Webster near the Corners in 1824. It was not until 1836 that Joshua Webster was ordained as an Episcopal Methodist minister. At that time, he moved his family to Hilton to take up his new post. That is why the marriage register begins in 1836. We can determine the location of the Webster farm near Hilton by looking at the land registry records. The first transaction shows that in March of 1856, Joshua Webster obtained the patent from the Crown for 110 acres in the north part of Lot 6, Concession 4 of Brighton Township. This was 1856, so it's after 1852 when Brighton Township was created, so it is Brighton Township we're talking about. My expectation is that Reverend Webster probably lived on this land from the time he moved to the Hilton area in 1836, and probably rented or leased the land from the Crown Land Department, which was very common in those days. The Joshua Webster farm is highlighted in red here. It is to the immediate southwest of the village of Hilton. The third land transaction in May of 1856 shows that Joshua Webster sold 32 acres in the north end of his lot to John Crowder. And that is why that section of land up to the concession road is not included as part of the Webster farm. This was a working farm supported by Reverend Webster himself when he wasn't ministering to his flock. Also on the farm was his only son, Joel Merriman Webster, who married locally and stayed on the farm. The property was sold in 1874 to Cyrus Richmond. Let's remember that this map is a snip of the Belden County Atlas for Brighton Township, which was created in 1878. That's more than 2 decades after the Brighton and Seymour Gravel Road was built, and we can see that on the map there to the east of the village of Hilton. It's also 26 years after the most disastrous event ever to occur at Hilton, commonly known in local parlance as the breakaway. On April 21st, 1852, the small lake northwest of Hilton broke through its gravel banks, and the entire content of the lake cascaded down the valley to the east. This map represents the old lake as swampland. But let's think back to 1836 when Joshua Webster moved to Hilton. The main road through the village of Hilton to the north was called the Percy Road, and it ran along Richmond Street through the village and then north and ran along the northeast shore of the old lake before continuing on to Percy Township. Speaking of the breakaway, I want to tell you about a new project that I'm working on now in collaboration with the Brighton Digital Archives. We are planning to produce a video version of the breakaway story. This was a huge disaster when it occurred, shocking the community in many ways. There were 2 immediate results that were critical to the community. 2 men were killed in a sawmill that was located just to the east of where the campground is today in the valley north of Hilton. Second, there was major damage to the Percy Road there north of Hilton, where it ran around the edge of the lake. For months afterwards, all the traffic going north and south from Brighton up until the central and north part of the township had to find detours. The lumber business was at its peak at this time, so we can only imagine the delays and the frustrations. This led directly to the building of the Brighton and Seymour Gravel Road, which was completed very quickly by 1856. This is more or less our number 30 highway today. Project is in early stages at this point, but hopefully in the next year at some time, we'll see videos on the Brighton Digital Archives website about the breakaway. Let's look at one more reference to Mr. Webster on page 310 of the Tobey Book. In 1855, a petition signed by Joshua Webster, John Sprung, Benjamin Sprung, R.J. Morrow, Richard DeLong, J.C. Squire, and others declared that they wanted to locate the boundary between Brighton and Crammy townships exactly. This was completed on December 24th, 1855 by J.S. Peterson. And Mr. Peterson goes on to describe how he conducted the survey and how he placed new stone markers at the corners of lots in order to determine the boundaries between properties between Brighton and Crammy townships. In fact, this was a sore point for many years. It would result in petitions to council and some litigation. This is what happens when you mess with landowners and the boundaries of their property. But just imagine the unintended consequences of creating Brighton Township. Here are the 3 townships that resulted from the creation of Brighton Township on January 1st, 1852. As I do my work, I have to constantly remind myself of the location of that old border between Crammy and Murray Township. It started down at Presqu'île Bay, went up Cedar Street, then Prince Edward Street, then Yonge Street, and on north into the township a little east of number 30 highway today. We can see remnants of the old border in small side roads. There east of Hilton is Florence Road, where my friend Florence Chatton used to live. And north of Codrington is McCann Road. So if your home was located in the new Brighton Township, not only did your address change, but if you had property along the borders, land disputes would be a way of life for decades after this big change.